Oh, Sheryl, it's wonderful to see you again. And I don't know how many years since we've actually talked like this, which is a pity, because I'm sure you've been doing some amazing work and what have you. But it's a real pleasure to see you again and to have a chance to have a conversation in the way that we, would like to do right now. And particularly, I'd love to know about where you're at with everything after these numbers of years since I last saw you.
Thanks, Mary. It's good to see you too. I think it's been about 4 years. I think I saw you on the Gold Coast at the Paradigm Shift in 2018. That would have been the last time at the conference. Would that be right? I think so.
I think that's the last time.
Yeah. And like you just get busy with life and getting on with the work, the UFO work and all the other things too. I'm still continuing to run my monthly afterlife group and our UFO meetings online via Zoom for members and, like you, taking calls from witnesses and helping them and giving them support to work through their close encounter experiences. So we're probably living very parallel lives.
I think so, because we're both on a similar page, I think, with how we approach things and what have you. And it's wonderful that despite the chaos going on in the world, that we're still able to continue doing what we're doing. Because of the technology, it enables us to still connect across the globe and domestically as well. So, I think that's been a bonus. But I was interested because you do a lot of talks, which has been very much part of your work, hasn't it? So you've been able to do that on the internet as well, have you?
Yeah, it's been great to be involved in podcasts. I just love how podcasts burst forth on the scene, and you're talking to people that you wouldn't ordinarily speak to internationally. Just podcasts are everywhere. They're the in thing, aren't they?
It's good to know that you're well and that you're still working hard to do what you love and what you're so passionate about.
Yeah, and the same for you too.
I think that your wonderful research over more time than I've been involved, actually, Sheryl. I know that you've been involved in this longer than myself. I'd be really interested to hear how you've seen it evolve from when you first started to where it's taken you now in terms of your approach. Is that very different now? And if so, how has it evolved into being different? And what are you finding now from what you found out then? Would be, I'd find absolutely fascinating.
For those who don't know me, I'm Sheryl Gottschall, a UFO researcher, paranormally interested and shamanic explorer. In answer to Mary's question, Mary, when I first got involved in '88, I had a very black and white view of the UFO subject. Because we were receiving reports from the public, so it was all about sightings and, craft and direction and speed and altitudes, all that sort of thing. It still is. That's really important to document that. And I sort of had this very naive view that if I gathered enough evidence and laid it at the feet of people, that I'd be able to convince them that extraterrestrial life was real. But I soon snapped out of that, that's for sure. But over time, and it happened during the 90s when the alien abduction phenomenon became prevalent all around the world, for that decade-long period where day after day people would contact us, and UFO organisations everywhere and independent UFO researchers like yourself too, that it very quickly moved from sightings to the occupants and what the heck are they doing here and what are they doing to us, basically. But then I saw something emerging, which was how those experiences changed people, changed them in ways that there was a core group of significant changes toward a robust list, I guess you could say, of how people became less interested in material things and became more spiritually engaged. And they're often highly creative people. They developed all these not strange, but I guess it is strange to many people, abilities, like they became precognitive. And I really, it wasn't until probably about 2005 that it actually clicked, actually dawned on me that half the people that I'd interviewed earlier on, they had told me, and I said to them, have you had any other unusual experiences? They said, it wasn't a UFO experience, but I had this strange experience where I nearly died. And I left my body and I saw this spirit being. And they talked about a classic near-death experience, but I didn't sort of click. You know, I don't know about you, Mary. Did that sort of click for you straight away that that was happening for people?
What was interesting for me was to find out those that had talked about having an out-of-body experience or a near-death experience would then start seeing not only angelic beings and other beings, but what we call the classic, ET as well. So that was how I put two and two together.
Yeah. So from there, it just evolved into what I call the close encounter package with people who are reporting close encounter experiences. That wasn't the only thing that was happening in their life. Their lives were riddled with paranormal experiences. And then again, I made another shift around 2010 when, for myself personally, I was trying to understand why I was so interested in the afterlife and why I was so interested in the UFO phenomenon. And it sort of led me on a path towards shamanism. And that for me was really a clincher, in that I then took the understandings that I had from the learnings that I gained through those trainings, which I now teach myself, to recognize that the people who'd had close encounter experiences and a whole lot of other types of experiences, including near-death experiences, to me, they became what I termed shamanized, in that they went through this process of transformation where they struggled with their identity once they, tried to find a place for it in their life. And they struggled through the loss of that identity after they'd had that experience. They purely, deconstructed themselves right down to the basics and what shamans call the hollow bone. They had a dismemberment experience, and then they had to put themselves back together and reconstruct another identity that incorporated their close encounter experiences. And then I also saw that people were actually getting hung up on their experiences and they would struggle with them. And I recognized that the struggle was that they didn't really want to fully take them on board. And I don't blame them, because we don't have that context in our world, in the Western culture. So, but I would say to them, the way through this experience is to embrace it and to embrace the changes that you're undergoing, is what I really meant. And when you let it change you, you'll find that you'll go through it more readily. And I think that's where I'm still at today, is helping people, supporting people to understand that process that they're going through that shamanic perspective.
There were two things particularly that you mentioned that really resonate with me in terms of the shamanic side. And the reason that I really resonate with that is I was involved with CERN and Simon Harvey Wilson, a researcher I think you may remember Simon, bless his heart, he passed on a few years ago, but he did a thesis at the Eden Cowan University with the parallels between shamanism and abductions. And I was resource for that. And he put beautifully the parallels between abductions and shamanism. And in recent times, I've always called it the modern day shamanic wake-up call. Only it's called UFO abductions now, rather than as part of that. So for me, very much on the same path, in the sense that I, like you, have seen so many amazing shifts in awareness for those that are, finally transcend their fear and start to embrace the whole contact experience. And it changes them in multiple ways, as you well know. And of course, with the research that, I've been involved with the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Free Foundation, 85% noticed a psycho-spiritual transformation. So it all ties in. But like you, I started out There's very black and white too, you know, and very much wanting people to believe these beautiful souls that were struggling, isolated, afraid they were going crazy, all those kinds of things that you know, that they understandably they went through, to actually saying, you know, there's something else going on here. And I think over the years, that's where it's brought me as well, is how do I help them as they open up multidimensionally to manage that in a way that is in line with their 3D grounded self, so that it's not out there somewhere, but actually integrated into their whole psyche, which is where I think many of us have gone with this over the years.
You've just reminded me too that even people who are very, I guess you'd say black and white, have these experiences. And I'm thinking about Kevin Day, who was on the USS Princeton, was the radar operator. He talked about seeing so many objects in the sky. He described it as like snow falling. It was amazing. But after he'd had that experience of seeing that, which for him in his own world was like another wake up call, he started having these apocalyptic dreams where he'd dream of tsunamis and earthquakes, really challenging things for any person to actually view going on the planet. And I've found that this has come up before many times with people who have encounters, but probably more so, or maybe only during the 90s, I'm not really sure, that they would have these apocalyptic images pop into their head or have it in dream states. Or in some cases, which you're probably aware of too, is some people claim to have been taken onto spaceships, whether they are underground or in our own space, and they would be shown these images purposefully. And I just wonder how all that fits in. What's that really about? Is, you know, for people who have these experiences, I initially thought, well, maybe it's to do with their world turning upside down. And when we imagine our own world turning upside down, we think of earthquakes, tsunamis, etc., cataclysmic events, asteroids hitting the planets. But, you know, perhaps it's much more than that. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a good one, Sheryl. Actually, I met Kevin and spoke with him for a couple of hours when I was in Nevada. And what blew me away was the way his whole awareness had changed, and how he was so passionate now about, especially about uncovering all of this publicly. But like you, what's interesting is some have precognitive dreams, as you know, and some of it I think is a warning more than anything, rather than an obvious that's going to happen, but more if we don't change our ways, this is what's likely to happen. I'd rather look at it that way. It's all going to end, you know, and very soon. Just let's change our ways, please. And I'd be very happy to do that. So I'm interpreting that way because I'm very hopeful for humanity. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, well, I am too, actually. I think that it's very interesting because I've been thinking more and more these days about, because we've all been through the last couple of years, which has been pretty drastic. There's been a lot of divisiveness created, which is very patriarchal. It's not really of the sacred feminine wisdom, the way that things have been handled over the last couple of years. It's interesting that many of the people who came forward during the 90s who had reported close encounters to me were women. Did you notice that? Absolutely.
Although, have you also noticed that has shifted to more men now? I remember having one experience, a group where there were 14 men and only 2 women. And it's about the only spiritual type of group that generally I had a preponderance of men. And I put that down to the nuts and bolts that has always attracted the male energy. Then, you know, look at all the lineups in conferences. What do you see? You see 14 men and 2 token women or whatever. So it's very much been, I think, because it's been very much on the nuts and bolts, and men particularly are more comfortable with that. They can handle that kind of way of looking at the phenomena. But I think so much has changed since then, and you're aware of it, and I am, that now it's becoming more about consciousness. rather than how big was the craft, how many times did you see it, with 3 or 4 people with you, how long, did you get any photographs and what have you, but the changes that happened.
So when you talk about it being, it's all about consciousness now, how can you expand on that a bit more, how you see that playing itself out?
Well, I think the indicator for me was when I wrote Awakening, because I noticed the changes in people's psyche, the way they looked at things more spiritually. They were more holistically aware. They wanted to take care of the planet. They changed their diet. You've seen all of this as much as I have. And that fascinated me, because what we were getting was, evil aliens most of the time. That was the big consensus, they're all bad and they're out to get you. And I thought, well, doesn't quite fit, because we're getting all these individuals having these experiences. They're becoming more loving, more caring, less materialistic and what have you. And I thought, well, if they're doing that, they can't be as evil as they're made out. You know what I mean? It was like that. But I was, because I've always been interested on a deeper level, and I know you have as well, I've been looking at it more as a soul journey. And what I did discover and I'm sure you found it many times, when you ask them about, at that deeper level of participating in this, many would say, as a soul or pre-birth, there would be some form of acceptance or consent, because they will say, I've been one of them. I've been an Arcturian, or I've been, a mantis, or and I've incarnated in human. That turned it all on its head for me, because hold on a minute, is there really an us and them? Or is there just an us? And we've decided to incarnate into human from being one of these many intelligences. And again, this just opened a whole Pandora's box for me in how we interpret this experience, depending on how we choose to perceive it or to interpret it.
I agree with that. And just as an example, there was a woman who came to speak at my afterlife group a couple of years ago, and she was probably in her 60s, but she spoke about an experience she had when she was 12. And she was getting her tonsils removed. She was in hospital. The anesthesiologist got the mix, confused, or something was wrong, but she wasn't getting enough oxygen, and she actually flatlined and died and left her body. And after she left her body, the typical near-death experience that a lot of people describe was she saw a light at the end of a sort of like a tunnel. She saw streams of people in rows going towards the light who were in front of her, probably is behind her too. But she also saw a stream of people returning from the light going possibly towards Earth. But in that stream of people going in the reverse direction, she saw this little being, and she saw what we would describe as a little grey alien. And at the time, being 12 years old, so it would have been late 60s probably, she said that she thought, oh, poor little thing. It was all emaciated and had the big head, and she thought it was a deformed person, basically. She recovered, and that went on the shelf for a while, until she came to one of our UFO meetings, probably about 15 years ago now. And she walked in, and that particular night, someone was talking about alien abduction experiences. And she walked in, and on the screen was an image of a grey alien. And she said, that was exactly what I saw in the stream going back towards planet Earth. Really, again, has, opens up the whole story again. But there was also another experience back in 95, going back quite a while now, where I was running a New Age centre. And one night I held a night on near-death experiences. And a woman came, and she spoke about her experience of her young child who had died, quite young, like 5 or something like that. She'd been to the funeral that day. She came home. She laid on the bed. She could feel her heart rate getting slower and slower and slower. Next thing she knows, she's out of her body. and she's got the soul of her young daughter in her hand, and she's walking along a winding path. And she gets to the classic point of no return where people who aren't going to die actually have to return from. She sees a spirit being, and the spirit being indicates to give the soul of her daughter to the spirit being. After much angst that happens, and the spirit being, she's fine, I'll look after her. And the mother turns around and starts walking back on the winding path. And on the way, she sees a spaceship. And the next thing she knows, she's gone into the spaceship. She's lying down on a table of some description in a non-physical form, having some sort of examination done on her. That finishes, she gets up, she walks back along the path. Next thing she knows, she's in her body. Now, that happened in 95. That was the beginning of the change for me, because I put it on the shelf. I had nowhere to put it. There was no context in the field at that time for me to put that anywhere. And there's been a few things along the way, but when this woman came to the afterlife meeting some years ago and told me that story, again, that was another opening of how involved are these extraterrestrials in human incarnation, soul management, or overseeing the whole process. It just makes my mind boggle and leaves me with a heck of a lot of questions.
Well, I'm with you on that. And there's two things that come to mind. And one was a story of a 15-year-old when I was in the UK. The whole family had been taken up on board craft. There was the grandmother, the mother, and the 15-year-old son. And we wanted to find out how he remembered that experience. But he went to an experience where he was in his garden, and he was seeing this craft. And what was happening, just as he starts to see this grey being, he sees these balls of light. And he says, there's great granddad, and there's grandma, and there's, Uncle Joe. And I said to him, how do you know who these balls of light are? And he said, I just know. And I said, well, why are they here? And he said, they're here to help me feel safe and that everything's okay. And the grey being, he had an interaction with the grey being. But what blew me away was as the being went back onto the spacecraft, the orbs of light followed onto the spacecraft. And that was when, like yourself, it was that light bulb moment of, okay, so it's all connected. And then since then, more so, I've met individuals, and one was an 8-year-old boy that explained that his family were the mantis beings, and that when he's on board the spacecraft, sometimes he evaporates into the mantid form for a while. And I'd heard another young lady mention to me that when she was on the craft, she was in a grey body as a scientist doing a job. And I sort of said, well, where's your your human body? And she said, it's just sort of over there, hanging on, all type of thing. And I'm saying, so how do you get from this ET form back to your human form? And she described the ball of light, her soul reanimating her human body. And since then, I've come across many others as well. So like yourself, there's this, there isn't a boundary here. There's something else far bigger than we have ever imagined. When we come into it with one idea, it completely blows that out of the water, doesn't it?
There's a very big story going on. I think we've been missing it for a really long time. And maybe it's so big that we just can't wrap our minds around it. I'm not really sure. But do you remember the story of Betty Andreasen, who recently passed? She was having out-of-body experiences and being taken on board a craft. This one particular time I remember. The book that I'm thinking of where it's mostly discussed is in The Watchers.
Yes.
She talks about where she had been taken on board a craft by these little grey beings, and they took her to see the one. And when she entered the room, when she got to the room where she was going to see the one, they said, we can't, I think they said to her, we can't go in there, but you can go in. And she entered, and it was a room full of light. And she said there was an overwhelming feeling of love. She was just so indescribable. And it really reminded me of the reports of near-death experiences having similar types of situations in their experience too. And I wondered then, maybe that was one of the earlier cases of what we're getting at, which maybe wasn't recognized for what it was at the time that the book was published and her story came out. And there's probably a whole lot of things that we need to go back and have another look at. Because I even remember I saw an interview of Howard Menger, or Menger, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, who was the artist and one of the early contactees. And he talked about being taken on a spaceship to another planet where he met his deceased brother. And I thought, wow, really? Like, how did that happen, And again, I wondered, big question mark about what on earth is going on? Something really huge.
Well, I'll take that to another step that's come up more and more for me. I feel like I'm continually going down this rabbit hole, and everybody's saying, where are you going, Mary? And I'm saying, well, it's sort of taking me here now. And that's the past life connections that I'm sure you're aware of. A lot of this going on now, even more, is a lot of my, those coming to me are aware that their family have incarnated with them with a mission from other places, other galaxies or dimensions or whatever. And they're aware of that because they remember that they made an agreement to come in. And, that's been the next step for me. And one that was particularly interesting was a lady who'd been taken on board craft, and she saw there some of her really close friends. And it's like, this strange dream where I'm seeing all my friends. And one of them was a gentleman who they picked up as well, who even she remembers saying, when he said to her, this is awesome. He remembers being in the craft saying this to her, and she woke up the next day and got these phone calls from all her friends saying, we had this strange dream. We were on a spaceship and what happened. She remembers seeing them all there. And one of the interesting things was the memory that she had been told something, a message, if you like. And she says, Mary, I've got to remember the message. That's the most important thing, as well as everything else. And it took her back to Atlantis, where they were all light workers and they didn't fulfill the mission in Atlantis. So everything went kaboom. And they've come this time to take on that message and that mandate. This time, all of them have come back to do that. Now, this is what's intriguing me is, it just gets more and more complex and more incredible in terms of what I see as the soul journey, because that's the only name I can give it.